The tornado touched down 3 miles west of Elkhorn, Kansas, at 4:47 in the afternoon, and it did not lift again until it had carved a path of destruction 11 miles long and half a mile wide. It was not a single funnel, but a writhing mass of rotating wind, a darkness that stretched from the earth to the clouds, illuminated from within by the lightning that crackled through its heart. The roar was beyond sound, a vibration that shook the bones, that stopped thought, that reduced every living thing in its path to a single primal understanding. Death was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. Nowhere except a hole in the ground that everyone had called foolish. The people of Elkhorn had perhaps 4 minutes of warning, 4 minutes between the moment the funnel became visible on the western horizon and the moment it struck the first buildings on the edge of town. 4 minutes to run, to pray, to make peace with whatever God they believed in. 4 minutes to realize that the wooden structures they had built, the homes and stores and churches they had trusted to shelter them, were about to become missiles in a wind that could drive straw through oak planks. Most of them ran for their homes. Most of them dove into root cellars that were 4 feet deep, 5 feet deep, barely adequate against ordinary storms. Most of them pressed themselves against walls and prayed that the walls would hold. 70 of them ran for Ezekiel Thorne's hole. They ran because they had no other choice, because the hole was the closest shelter, because in the face of absolute destruction, even pride becomes a luxury no one can afford. They ran past the sign that someone had planted at the edge of Ezekiel's property, Thorne's Folly, painted in mocking letters, and they squeezed through the reinforced entrance and descended the stone steps into a shelter that went down 20 feet into the Kansas earth. 20 feet. While every other cellar in Elkhorn went down 4 or 5, Ezekiel Thorne had dug 20 feet straight down into the bedrock, had lined the walls with limestone blocks, had reinforced the ceiling with railroad ties bought second-hand from a rail crew passing through, had created a shelter so deep and so strong that the tornado passing overhead would be nothing more than a distant rumble. The town had laughed at him for 7 years. They had called him simple. They had called his hole foolish. They had watched him dig, day after day, year after year, and they had shaken their heads at the waste of a life spent burrowing into the earth like a mole. Now 70 of them, huddled in that hole, while the world above them was erased, and they understood, too late, that Ezekiel Thorne had been the only one among them who truly understood what the Kansas sky could do. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in tornado country, the plains, or somewhere the sky turns that particular shade of green, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the wind comes and the only shelter is the one they mocked. Ezekiel had come to Kansas in the spring of 1874, a man of 26 with strong arms, a quiet manner, and a way of speaking that made people assume he was slow. He was not slow. His mind worked perfectly well. But he had been born with a stutter so severe that words came out in fragments and repetitions that exhausted both speaker and listener. Somewhere in his youth, he had learned that silence was easier than struggle, and he had become a man of few words, a man who let his actions speak for him, a man whom the world persistently underestimated. He had filed a claim on 160 acres of Kansas prairie, good flat land with deep soil and a reliable well. He had built a small soddy in the first year, then replaced it with a proper frame house in the third, working slowly and methodically as he always did. His bay mare, Molly, pulled his plow and hauled his materials and stood patiently while he loaded and unloaded the endless supplies that a homestead required. The tornadoes had come in his second year on the claim. He had seen them in the distance first, dark fingers reaching down from clouds that seemed to boil with malevolent intent. They had not struck near his property, but they had struck elsewhere, had destroyed farms and killed livestock, and occasionally killed people who had not found shelter in time. Ezekiel had watched those distant funnels and understood something that his neighbors seemed to ignore. The Kansas sky was not benevolent. It was patient, waiting, and eventually it would come for everything that stood against it. His neighbors built root cellars. Everyone had root cellars, small underground spaces, 4 or 5 feet deep, where families could shelter during storms. The cellars were adequate for ordinary weather, for the thunderstorms and hail that swept across the plains regularly. But Ezekiel had seen what a real tornado could do, had traveled to a farm 40 miles south where one had struck directly, had stood in the crater where a house had been, and seen the root cellar that had been ripped open like a tin can, its occupants thrown 100 yards into a field where they had been found broken and dead. 4 feet was not enough. 5 feet was not enough. Against a real tornado, a direct hit, anything less than true depth was merely a grave waiting to be opened. Ezekiel had decided to dig deeper. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. The digging began in the spring of 1875, and it did not stop for 7 years. He started with a shovel, working in the early mornings and late evenings when the farm work permitted. The first 4 feet were easy, loose topsoil that yielded readily to the blade. The next 4 feet were harder, dense clay that had to be loosened with a pickaxe before it could be removed. Below that was limestone bedrock, and the limestone required something more than hand tools. Ezekiel learned to use dynamite. He purchased small quantities from the mining supply in Dodge City, learning through trial and error how to place charges that would crack the rock without collapsing the hole. He learned to read the stone, to find the natural fractures where explosives would be most effective. He learned patience, the particular patience of a man who understands that great works are not built in days or months, but in years of steady effort. The hole grew deeper, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. The walls required shoring now, and Ezekiel began lining them with limestone blocks that he quarried from an outcropping 2 miles distant, hauling them to the site with Molly's help, fitting them together with a mortar of his own mixing. The work was slow, backbreaking, endless, but Ezekiel did not stop. The people of Elkhorn noticed in the 3rd year when the hole had reached 12 feet and showed no signs of stopping. Harlan Cobb was the mayor of Elkhorn, a man who had made his modest fortune selling farm equipment and who considered himself an authority on all matters practical. He visited Ezekiel's claim one summer afternoon, peered down into the deepening pit, and emerged shaking his head. "The thorn," he said, unconsciously mimicking the stutter he had heard Ezekiel use on the rare occasions when the man spoke. "What in God's name are you digging? A well? A mine? A grave?" Ezekiel had considered the question, had weighed the effort of explaining against the certainty that explanation would be dismissed, and had finally spoken the single word that required the least struggle. Shelter." "Shelter?" Cobb laughed. "You've already got a root cellar. Everyone's got a root cellar. What do you need with a hole that goes down to China?" Ezekiel had not answered. He had simply returned to his work, and Cobb had returned to town with a story that spread through Elkhorn within days. The simple man was digging a hole to China. The stutterer, who could barely string a sentence together, was burrowing into the earth like a gopher, and no one knew why. It was the funniest thing anyone had heard in months. Vernon Pike, who owned the general store and served as the town's unofficial social arbiter, coined the name that would stick for the next 4 years. Thorn's Folly, he called it, and soon everyone was using the phrase. Someone even painted a sign and planted it at the edge of Ezekiel's property, where visitors could see it and laugh. Ezekiel saw the sign. He did not remove it. He simply kept digging. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. By 1878, the hole was 16 feet deep, and Ezekiel had begun work on the ceiling. This was the most critical part, the structure that would bear the weight of whatever force pressed down upon it. He purchased railroad ties from a crew that was replacing worn track, hauling them back to his claim and laying them across the opening in layers, 3 ties thick, creating a roof that could support the weight of a collapsed building or resist the suction of a tornado passing directly overhead. He did not explain this to anyone. He could not have explained it even if he had wanted to. The words would have tangled in his mouth, would have come out in fragments that made him sound even more foolish than people already believed him to be. So he worked in silence, and the town watched in amusement, and the hole grew deeper and stronger while everyone laughed. The entrance was the final element. Most root cellars had simple wooden doors that opened outward, doors that could be ripped away by strong winds, that provided no protection against debris, that were more liability than shelter in a serious storm. Ezekiel designed something different. His entrance was a reinforced tunnel that descended at an angle, with 2 heavy doors, one at the surface, one at the bottom of the tunnel, creating an airlock that would resist the pressure changes of a tornado. The doors were built from railroad ties, hinged with iron hardware, designed to seal tight against any force the sky could produce. The shelter was completed in the spring of 1881, 7 years after the first shovel broke ground. 20 feet deep, 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, lined with limestone, roofed with railroad ties, accessible through a reinforced tunnel with double doors. It could hold 100 people if necessary, could sustain them for days with the supplies Ezekiel had stockpiled, could survive a direct hit from the largest tornado the plains had ever seen. The people of Elkhorn did not understand what he had built. They saw only a hole, a very deep, very expensive, very foolish hole that a simple man had wasted 7 years of his life creating. The sign at the edge of his property still stood. Thorn's Folly. The laughter still echoed whenever his name was mentioned in town. Ezekiel did not try to convince them otherwise. He had built what he knew was needed. Whether they understood it or not was beyond his control. The years passed. The shelter sat ready, its entrance visible at the edge of Ezekiel's property, its depths unknown to anyone who had not climbed down to see. Ezekiel used it during ordinary storms, retreating to its safety whenever the sky turned threatening, emerging unharmed while his neighbors cowered in their shallow cellars and prayed. He offered shelter to others during these storms. A simple gesture, an open door, a willingness to share what he had built. A few accepted, particularly those with children who feared the thunder and lightning. Most refused, unwilling to descend into Thorn's Folly, unwilling to admit that the simple man might know something they did not. And then came June 8th, 1882. The day began hot and still, the kind of oppressive Kansas heat that pressed down on the land like a weight. By noon, the clouds had begun to build in the west, towering thunderheads that climbed miles into the sky, their tops spreading into the distinctive anvil shapes that experienced plainsmen recognized as trouble. By 3 o'clock, the sky had turned the particular shade of green that meant hail at best, tornado at worst. By 4, the first funnel was visible on the horizon. It was not one funnel. It was 3, a family of tornadoes dancing across the prairie, merging and separating, their paths unpredictable, but their destination increasingly clear. They were moving toward Elkhorn, and they were moving fast. The warning spread through town in minutes. People ran for their cellars, their churches, their strongest buildings. They did what they had always done during tornado warnings, sought shelter, and prayed that the storm would pass them by. Ezekiel Thorne stood at the entrance to his shelter and watched the approaching darkness. He had seen many storms in his years on the plains, but nothing like this. The 3 funnels had merged now into a single massive wedge, a churning wall of destruction half a mile wide that was consuming everything in its path. It was coming directly for Elkhorn. It would not miss. He turned and ran toward town. He could not shout a warning. His stutter would have made any cry unintelligible. But he could run, and he could wave, and he could physically grab people and point them toward the shelter they had mocked for 7 years. He ran through the streets of Elkhorn with his arms windmilling, with his face twisted in the effort of communication, with every fiber of his being focused on the single message. Follow me. Some followed. They followed because they saw the terror in his eyes, because they heard the approaching roar, because in that moment of absolute crisis, they finally understood that Thorne's folly was not foolish at all. They grabbed their children and ran. They pulled their elderly parents from houses that were about to become coffins. They abandoned their possessions, their pride, their years of mockery, and they followed the simple man toward the hole in the ground that had been their favorite joke. 70 people descended into Ezekiel Thorne's shelter in the 4 minutes before the tornado struck. They squeezed through the reinforced entrance, stumbled down the stone steps, and crowded into the limestone-lined chamber that went down 20 feet into the Kansas bedrock. Ezekiel was the last one in, pulling the inner door closed behind him, sealing them all in darkness as the world above began to scream. The tornado passed directly over the shelter. The sound was beyond description, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that vibrated through the stone walls and the railroad tie ceiling, that made thought impossible and prayer automatic. The pressure changed wildly, ears popping, lungs struggling, the air itself seeming to flex and pulse as the vortex passed overhead. Debris struck the ceiling, impacts that would have been fatal in any lesser structure, that the railroad ties absorbed without yielding. It lasted perhaps 90 seconds. 90 seconds that felt like hours. 90 seconds during which 70 people huddled in darkness and understood that they were alive, only because a man they had called simple had spent 7 years building exactly this. Then the sound faded. The pressure stabilized. The screaming wind became a whisper, then silence. Ezekiel climbed the stairs alone, opened the outer door, and looked upon a world transformed. Elkhorn was gone, not damaged, gone. The buildings that had stood for a decade had been reduced to scattered lumber and shattered glass. The church where families had gathered every Sunday was a pile of kindling. The general store where Vernon Pike had coined Thorne's Folly was simply not there anymore, its foundations visible, its contents distributed across a mile of Kansas prairie. Bodies of livestock lay everywhere, killed by debris or wind or the simple impossibility of surviving what had passed. And scattered among the wreckage were the remains of root cellars, 4 feet deep, 5 feet deep, ripped open by the tornado's fury, their occupants exposed to forces that human bodies could not survive. 17 people died in Elkhorn that day. 17 people who had sheltered in cellars that were not deep enough, in buildings that were not strong enough, in places that offered the illusion of safety without its substance. But 70 lived, 70 people who had followed the simple man into his foolish hole and emerged to find that everything they owned was destroyed, but they themselves remained. The gathering came 2 weeks later, held in a tent that had been sent from Wichita, along with relief supplies. The survivors of Elkhorn assembled to reckon with what had happened, to mourn the dead, to acknowledge the living, and to honor the man who had made the difference. Mayor Harlan Cobb spoke first, the man who had mocked Ezekiel's digging, who had laughed at the hole to China, who had spread the joke throughout the town he was supposed to lead, stood before the survivors with a humility that his previous life had never required. 7 years ago, I visited Ezekiel Thorne's property and asked him what he was building. He told me, in the few words he could manage, that it was a shelter. I laughed. I went back to town and told everyone what the simple man was doing, and we all laughed together. He stopped, his voice breaking. My wife is alive because of that shelter. My children are alive. I am alive. The 17 people we buried this week died in cellars that were 4 feet deep, because that was deep enough for me, because I never imagined that the sky could do what we all saw it do. Ezekiel Thorne imagined it. He prepared for it. He built something that could survive it. And when the moment came, he ran through town and saved everyone he could reach. Vernon Pike spoke next. The storekeeper who had named the shelter Thorne's Folly, whose sign still stood, miraculously undamaged, at the edge of Ezekiel's property, could barely meet the eyes of those assembled. I made that sign, he confessed. I thought it was funny. I thought we were all sharing a joke about a man too simple to know when to stop digging. I was wrong. We were all wrong. The folly was not Ezekiel's hole. The folly was our laughter. Others spoke. The families who had followed Ezekiel into the shelter. The children who had survived because their parents had trusted a man they had mocked. The elderly who had been pulled from houses seconds before those houses ceased to exist. When the testimonies were complete, the survivors turned to Ezekiel, who stood at the edge of the gathering as he had always stood at the edge of everything, apart, quiet, watching. Mr. Thorne, Cobb said, would you like to say anything? The question hung in the air. Everyone knew about Ezekiel's stutter, knew the struggle that speech required of him, knew that he would likely decline as he had declined every other invitation to speak. But Ezekiel stepped forward. He looked at the faces of those he had saved, at the ruins of the town that had laughed at him, at the sky that had done exactly what he had always known it could do. And he spoke. I saw what the wind could do, he said, each word an effort, each syllable a small victory. I knew, someday it would come here. I couldn't warn you. Words don't work for me, so I dug. He gestured toward the shelter, toward the entrance that had saved 70 lives. The hole is still there. It will always be there. FF for next time. The silence that followed was not the silence of discomfort at his stutter. It was the silence of people understanding, for the first time, what it had cost him to build something so important when he could not explain why it mattered. Then someone began to clap, then another, then all of them, 70 people applauding the man they had called simple, honoring the work they had called folly, acknowledging at last that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from those who cannot dress it in fine words. Thank you for watching this story about Ezekiel Thorne and the shelter of Elkhorn. When we mock those who cannot speak for themselves, we sometimes miss the wisdom they are trying to share through their actions. If this story reminded you that depth of character matters more than ease of speech, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever dismissed you because of how you communicate, until the day your actions spoke louder than their words? Elkhorn was rebuilt in the years that followed, but it was rebuilt differently. Every new structure had a storm shelter, not a shallow root cellar, but a deep refuge built to Ezekiel's specifications. The town that had mocked one man's preparation became a community of preparers, each household maintaining its own protection against the sky that had shown them what it could do. Ezekiel's original shelter was expanded and reinforced, designated as the town's official emergency refuge. A stone marker was placed at its entrance, replacing the mocking sign that had stood there for so long. The inscription was simple: 70 saved. June 8th, 1882. The phrase, digging a thorn, entered the vocabulary of the Kansas plains and spread across the tornado-prone states. It meant building protection that others considered excessive, preparing for disasters that seemed unlikely, trusting your own judgment over the mockery of those who could not see what you saw. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood that the person who digs while others laugh might be the only one still standing when the wind passes. Ezekiel Thorne lived in Elkhorn for another 41 years, passing in the spring of 1923 at the age of 75. His stutter never improved. He remained a man of few words all his life, but no one ever called him simple again. The children of Elkhorn grew up knowing his story, knowing that the quiet man on the edge of town had once saved 70 lives because he understood something about the sky that no one else could see. He was buried on his property near the entrance to the shelter he had built. The headstone bears an inscription that he reportedly chose himself, one of the few complete sentences he ever spoke without struggle. I could not warn you, so I dug. The survivors of that June day and their children and their grandchildren understood exactly what he meant.